Okay, we are going to take some notes on the Cold War. So you'll want to set up a notes entry in your journal or in a Google Doc, and you'll want to take notes throughout this lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to pause, obviously, throughout and write things down or re-listen to sections if you miss anything. So the Cold War, as we talked about last week, lasted a really long time. It lasted for several decades from the late 40s all the way into the early 90s. So this should be review. We talked about this last week before we watched the Shadow Peace video. But a Cold War is the absence of warfare. So there's this constant threat of war, that war could break out. Nations are hostile, and they are afraid that the other one might attack. So they're basically playing a game of chicken. During the Cold War, it was the democratic US versus the communist Soviet Union. And remember, when we talk about the Soviet Union, that is the same thing as Russia. The name changed after the Cold War. So while there isn't warfare, like direct battles between the US and the Soviet Union, there are still things called proxy wars during the Cold War. This includes the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And these are like adjacent wars, so they're fought about these same ideas of democracy versus communism, and we might get involved in these wars, but it's not a direct like US versus Soviet Union war. Okay, so I want to talk about the Iron Curtain. So in 1946, British leader Winston Churchill said the following. He said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." So what he's talking about is this blue line, and it's not like a literal iron curtain that like falls across Europe. This is a metaphor, and he's saying that the continent of Europe has essentially been split in two. And on one side, we have this like Western bloc, all of this purple area. These are all of the democratic countries that want democracy to spread and to be dominant throughout the world. And then there's this Eastern bloc and this whole red sphere of influence where the Soviet Union wants communism to be dominant and to spread around the world. So a metaphorical curtain falls across Europe within like a year after World War II ends. So this happens pretty much going right from World War II right into the Cold War here. And one part of the world that I really want to focus in on of this map is Germany. So when we look back, you can see right here, I'm outlining Germany, and it's split in two. Half of Germany is purple and part of this Western bloc, and half of Germany is red and part of this Eastern bloc. That's because Germany was divided up after World War II. And so the west half of Germany, known as Western Germany, was controlled by Britain, France, and the US. And this eastern half of Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. And then the same thing happened with Germany's capital, Berlin. So Germany obviously was controlled by Hitler and the Nazis during World War II, and so Germany lost power after World War II, and they lost their right to lead themselves. So they were split up into these two like mini countries. So instead of Germany being one country, there was West Germany, that was democratic, and East Germany, that was communist. And then same thing in Berlin. So East Berlin was communist and West Berlin was democratic. And so Germany itself becomes a big symbol during the Cold War because it is one country that has been divided and really represents this struggle over democracy and communism. So formal military alliances form as a result of this Iron Curtain. So if we go back and look at the map, we can see that that's actually what these red and purple colors were representing. The red was representing a military alliance called the Warsaw Pact, and this purple was representing a military alliance called NATO. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was the alliance formed by the Western Bloc, so the democratic nations. The US was also a part of NATO. And a big thing that we want to remember with NATO was this idea and philosophy, and part of this treaty said that if one nation that was a member got attacked, it was viewed as if all of the members were attacked. So if one country was going to war, we all were. And this was really significant for the US in particular because it gave us a formal tie to Europe. And this hadn't happened in centuries. And so earlier in the year when we talked about being isolationist during the Great Depression, NATO really represents a major shift. So when we joined World War II, obviously we're more interventionist, but now we are formally tied to Europe with this treaty, and that is a major interventionist policy. And then a few years later, the Eastern Bloc formally creates the Warsaw Pact. This didn't happen immediately after NATO was formed. It happened a few years later, and it was actually a response to West Germany joining NATO. So if we go back and look at this map, the yellow, blue, and green, so this western half of Germany, was admitted into NATO. And so because Germany was such a huge symbol during the Cold War and represented this struggle, that's what really causes the Eastern Bloc to create the Warsaw Pact. And so they have a couple goals for the Warsaw Pact. The first goal is to try to deter or prevent the members of NATO from attacking them. So they thought that having this pact and having this strong show of military force would prevent anyone from feeling like they could attack because they wanted to appear strong. And the second thing, they used this military pact to stop rebellions throughout the Eastern Bloc. So if we look at this map, these countries that were communist, here we've got the Soviet Union, and then these smaller countries that turned to communism. If there were rebellions in these countries, the Soviet Union would use the Warsaw Pact's power to put down those rebellions and to keep these countries under communist rule. Here's another map similar to the Iron Curtain map that I've been showing you, but this one is pulled out a little bit so we can see the whole world view. So we can see the US is part of NATO, and what we can also see that's kind of cool is these other countries in the light red and the light blue that aren't officially part of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, but they're still allies with those countries. Okay, so this slide might be one of the most important things we're talking about with this lecture. So you will want to make sure that you write this down. This single word, containment, really serves to set up this entire unit for us. So what is containment? The idea of containment is that we are going to stop the spread of communism at all costs. So we're going to stop communism from spreading no matter what it takes. And this is the major US foreign policy during the Cold War. It's what drives us to form NATO and join NATO. It's what drives our policies at home, and it's what causes us to join and get involved in other wars like the Vietnam War. And the whole reason why containment becomes so dominant and why this policy is so pervasive in the US is because there's this growing threat of the Soviet Union and this growing communist threat that communism might start spreading around the world. And if it starts spreading, then maybe it gets to the US. So this political cartoon really shows that. This bear is supposed to represent the Soviet Union or the USSR, and we can see all of these arrows are showing communism moving all around the world. So moving to China and the Middle East and Western Europe, all the way to Cuba. And down here we've got Uncle Sam, who is terrified by this. Okay, so the main assignments and activities for our digital days this week is an analysis of the Truman Doctrine. So the Truman Doctrine, remember, before I start this, Truman was the president at this point. He was the one that took over for Roosevelt when FDR passed away, and he was the one that dropped the atomic bombs, and he is still president now at the start of the Cold War. And he makes this doctrine that really is what officially starts the Cold War, and this is what most historians point to as being the official beginning in 1947. So some things before you go in and do this assignment in UC, I want to give us a little bit of background information for the Truman Doctrine. So after World War II, so much of the world is absolutely decimated. So particularly we're thinking about places in Europe, like in the Mediterranean and like in Asia. And so a couple countries in particular are Greece and Turkey. So right away, what you look at with the Truman Doctrine, you'll see that he's referencing Greece. And so Greece is they're in a bad way. We can see a couple pictures here of Greece post-World War II. The children don't have shoes, their clothes are ragged, houses are destroyed. And so what we want to know and remember as we read through the Truman Doctrine in your next activity is that when people are facing so much hardship, it is very natural for people to look for change. We know that this is what helped Hitler come to power, is that the Treaty of Versailles put so much strain on Germany that they wanted someone that would make things better and that would change things. So that is natural. People look to change if they're experiencing hardship. And so around the world, as these countries are in shambles and are experiencing this hardship, well, communism starts to look like the face of change. And communism looks like potentially a good alternative that might help them and might change their lives. And so Truman has a goal, and he wants to stop communism from spreading, and he wants to stop communism from being the face of change. He wants democracy to be what people turn towards. And remember this idea, stopping the spread of communism, that is what we call containment. So you guys are going to now move on to your next step in your daily agenda, and over the rest of today and tomorrow, you'll actually be analyzing some excerpts from the Truman Doctrine and someone's response to the Truman Doctrine and what they have to say about what Truman says. So please shoot me an email if you have any questions at all, one about this lecture, if you want me to re-explain anything, or any questions about the Truman Doctrine and the activities that you're about to do. So thank you guys. Have a wonderful day.